Censorship and moral outrage is like a shapeshifter. It's always been there, but it changes form, assuming new disguises. No matter where the moral finger wagging is coming from, religious lunatics, right-wing moralists, or left-wing cancellation mobs, it's always the same nonsense. They're telling us how to live our lives, dude! The 50s had Elvis's hips, and conservative America didn't like that. These hips were hypnotizing teenage girls into feeling, and therefore, it was the actual work of Satan himself. In the 90s, you had moral outrage over everything from Tupac to Nine Inch Nails to Quentin Tarantino to Child's Play 3. It was all filth, and it was going to make you a murderer. And now, anything that's involving critical thought, counter-arguments, or just stuff that's actually funny is considered to be so dangerous that those that peddle it must be domestic terrorists. I could give examples from each decade if you cared to listen, but apparently you're busy or something, so I'll have to move on. The point is that, like Jurassic Park, nature finds a way, and nature wants us to consume artists' filth, because it makes us better people. Facts. Unfortunately for shape-shifting moralists, technology has always led the way to allow us to navigate around their systems of control, and in turn, they always find a way to regulate our newfound freedom. And then, we just find another way around it.
High-speed quick finder runs at 9 times normal speed. Pause and still button plus frame-by-frame operation. 14-day timer. Cordless remote control, which can also change channels on your color TV set. Warning buzzer prevents operating errors. The VS5 is ready when you are. The revolutionary VS5 lets Akai do the thinking. Look for it at your Akai retailer today. You simply can't miss.
Before the wild west of the internet gave us unlimited and uncensored access to everything a moral grandstander's worst nightmare couldn't even conjure, there was a mad and wonderful invention called home video and the VCR. Before home video, you could only consume film content on the propaganda idiot box, or what you might call the TV, and the popcorn-munching cesspool of idiocy you know as the cinema. Unless you go to an art house cinema, of course. Then, like me, you're a pretentious wanker. In the UK, the greatest empire that ever taught the world how to act proper, we've always had heavy censorship and institutions filled with evil overlords deciding what and what wasn't good for our feeble little minds. For television, you had decisions made by the channels themselves and overseen by organizations like Ofcom, an institution that's on speed dial for every phone owned by Ken and Karen outraged. For films, you had, and still have, the delightful BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, not to be confused with the rebranding of the BBC, which was to be the British Broadcasting Boy Clowns. Film classification, if you don't know, is just a label applied to tell you what age you should be or your children should be in order to watch a film.
When you rent or buy a video, you need to know that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home. To help you understand what the film is like, you can look at the certificate it has been given.
Film classifications have changed over the years. In the beginning, from 1912 onward, you had U for universal, content suitable for everyone, and A, approved for adult audiences, adults being anyone over the age of 16. Translated into nowadays, that would be anyone over the age of 42. Then in 1932, they threw in a new certificate, H, standing for horrific. This was for over 16s, and A was changed to be for over 11s, with under 11s having to be accompanied by a parent. Then in 1951, they replaced H with X. Not ecstasy, just X, for X-rated, which sounds like a change in drug habits, but it was just the same deal as H, but rebranded. Then in the 70s, they changed A from over 11 to over 8, and added AA, which was 14s and over, powered by batteries. That was a joke, just in case you got really confused about how children get their energy. Then roll on to 1982, and we get to pretty much what we have in the present day. U, PG, which is parental guidance. Then you had 15, suitable for 15 and over, and 18 for 18 and over. You also had something called R18, which still exists today, but isn't that well recognized or known. because this label mainly applies to sexy time films that you find in sexy time shops. The only additions to the rating classification system since then have been the 12 certificate in 1989, which I recall clearly because Tim Burton's Batman was given the first ever 12 rating, which meant I couldn't go see it. In addition to 12, there is now 12A, which is like PG, but if you're under 12, you must be accompanied by an adult. Responsible or not, that adult must be there, regardless. Now, back in the early 80s, these classifications were applied to cinemas, but the super futurist technology of video didn't have to carry such ratings. They were free. Whereas most films that came through the cinema to video would receive classification, and don't forget, to get such classification meant re-editing and resubmitting films at the cost of the filmmakers and studios to please the arbiters of morality at the BBFC. Some could go straight to video without having to be submitted. The video market had no regulations or legislation put in place, except for the Obscene Publications Act of 1959, which was amended in 1977 to cover sexy time films. Films that had previously been refused classification by the BBFC and banned from the UK now had a chance to reach a British audience, and legally, technically, video nasties began to flourish because back then a lot of major film distributors wouldn't release their titles onto home video due to fears over mass piracy. If only they'd had more foresight. Much like looking at ass and titties on the internet, suddenly everyone, particularly the youth, had access to a whole new world of cinematic filth they'd never been able to access before. In fact, this access was so free, it inspired filmmakers and producers to create even filthier filth than they'd ever been able to before. This was to start a great period of hysteria that lasted for a few years called the Video Nasty Era. Now, the Video Nasty Era refers to a period in the early 80s up until the Video Recordings Act of 1984, but its legacy carried on right up until the 90s and beyond. The Video Nasty hysteria is simple to explain. Violent and uncensored films on video were making children violent psychopaths. Some of you may be familiar with the idea and how it's been applied to video games in more recent times. How even Joker was a cause for concern because incels would shoot up a cinema because, you know, whatever. The Video Recordings Act would lead to the banning of countless films and push a new era of censorship and moral outrage not seen since the 1950s. So who started it? And what was it all about? Easy. The fear and outrage machine that you may know as the corporate media pretty much started it. Like how they start all wars, in conjunction with a few virtue-signaling busybodies that took the narrative, ran with it, and became household names. In particular, Mary Whitehouse.
Well, we start with violence to the truth, if I may say so. I mean, there are now over 700 pieces of scientific... I'll send you some. I'll send you the lot.
Scientific what?
Scientific research internationally showing a link between televised and social violence. So...
That's not that one on the head as far as you're concerned.
Absolutely
right?
So.
Mary Whitehouse was a conservative activist and teacher, an all-round killjoy. Whitehouse came to prominence in the 1960s with her Clean Up TV campaign. Whitehouse had become shocked by the moral decline she'd seen in her school students, and she blamed television, in particular, the BBC. Mary was so committed to banning filth that she gave up teaching to become a full-time activist. It may be hard to imagine, now in the 2020s, that a conservative would be an activist, a teacher, and someone who wanted to ban stuff. But back then conservatives were very conservative, as opposed to how it is now when it's liberals and socialists who are very conservative. Whitehouse went after everything from Doctor Who to Clockwork Orange to Benny Hill. Mary Whitehouse's name became synonymous with censorship and moral outrage, so much so that it inspired the name of a 90s comedy sketch show. Mary Whitehouse is often credited with coining the term video nasty, after a PR stunt that seriously backfired. Cannibal Holocaust is one of the most famous video nasty titles, and rightly so. It pretty much started the whole thing. Not just because of its nasty content, but because its producers kickstarted the whole 80s movie cancel season. The PR team had an ingenious idea of writing a letter to Mary Whitehouse, posing as a concerned member of the public who'd seen this vile filth. This was a clever little marketing ploy, one that's been used throughout the ages. Unfortunately, it was so effective at stirring up spicy public outrage publicity that it got the film banned, which isn't quite what you want. Whitehouse would proceed to go after a bunch of other naughty, violent movies, and eventually these films would be banned under the 1984 Video Recordings Act. But to credit Whitehouse as being the catalyst for the drafting of the Video Recordings Act would be incorrect. Like most activists, she didn't have the gravitas to make real change. The only people who can stir up such a stink and force the government into doing silly things are the people who work in the corporate media, or who I like to call the fear and outrage machine. During the early 80s and, well, during every decade until the sun runs out of fire, the press in the UK were printing the usual fear-mongering articles to whip up panic and outrage, inspired by whatever was popular at the time. Stories of moral decline, particularly of the youth, were very popular. Moral panic has always been a great cash cow for the corporate press. People just can't get enough of reading about these things that make them scared and angry. There were consistent reports of children committing horrid acts of violence and debauchery. And once the corporate media discovered what films you could watch at home on your fancy new VCR, they got positively moist. The Evil Dead, Driller Killer, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the rest. These weren't the kind of films that you should allow your children to watch. The corporate media would go on to become obsessed with the idea that this moral decline was in fact inspired by the so-called video nasties that had flooded the new straight-to-video market. It was a mixture of moral outrage and the fear of technology all wrapped up into a lovely little package. And why? Well, to understand why, you need to understand how most media narratives are constructed, which is very simple. It's similar to how modern wild conspiracy theories are conjured up. All you have to do is find a couple of things that are going on in the world and then just decide that they correlate without any research or hard evidence. Here's a little example I've made up. If you decide that, say, Katy Perry is an Illuminati stooge who's been brainwashed using MK Ultra techniques, all you have to do is look at this music video, spot the symbols, and there's your evidence and correlation. The media did the very same thing with their connection between low-budget VHS-released horror movies and horrendous crimes committed by a very, very, very small minority of children. It's like this. People have VCRs. Video nasty movies make up a large percentage of the VHS market. Children can watch things on VCRs. Children are watching video nasties and reenacting what they see and killing people. It's a very simple formula, and it is as basic and ill-thought as that. Once this narrative had been decided upon, the media had a right old time. One of the earliest news stories came from the greatest fear machine of all, the Daily Mail. An article titled, "The Secret Video Show" in 1982. More and more children, well used to video recorders in school, are catching on to the fact that their parents' machines can give them the opportunity to watch the worst excesses of cinema, sex and violence. This, like many instances of moral panic and outrage, was based upon pure assumption. The Times soon caught on to this new spicy panic narrative and printed their own delightful article called "How High Street Horror is Invading the Home. Uncensored horror video cassettes available to anybody of any age have arrived in Britain's high streets. They exploit extremes of violence and are rapidly replacing sexual pornography as the video trade's biggest money spinner." And this kind of juicy article narrative just went on and on and on. Like all good corporate media fear narratives, this one caught the attention of political parties looking for their own narrative to sell to a disgruntled public. The Conservative Party, like any political party, saw the video nasty panic as an ideal opportunity. As they were about to fight it out to remain in power in 1983, the hysteria around VHS nasty time films gave them a cause to get behind and show that they were what the public needed. A serious political party who were tough on law and order. During a period of high-profile rioting such as in Toxteth, Brixton and New Cross, the public were feeling like they couldn't protect them and weren't so serious when it came to crime. And like any great political machine, the Conservatives would show them exactly how serious they were by getting tough and serious on an issue that didn't really exist. Solving poverty and crime and racism and anything complicated is just too much effort for politicians. They're not built with enough intellect for that, but they will still tell you that they can. And even better still is when you can solve a problem that isn't very real.
I believe they're living in a different world to that world that I live in. I believe that research is taking place, and it will show that these films not only affect young people, but I believe they affect adults as well.
Once the Conservative Party had jumped on the video nasty train, it was all go, 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 culminating in the creation of the 1984 Video Recordings Act. Under the Act, the BBFC became responsible for classifying both cinema and home video releases, and therefore decided what could and could not be released on video. By law, any supply of unclassified videos became a criminal offence. A list of video nasties had already been drawn up in 1983. Some were able to be re-edited and approved by the BBFC, but many others were banned outright and remained banned for many years. This included The Exorcist, which was banned in 1986 and never released again until 1999. This was also the case for The Evil Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Last House on the Left, Cannibal Holocaust, The Driller Killer, and for some weird reason, Foxy Brown. During this time, rental shops would be raided by the police, people would be prosecuted and fined thousands of pounds. This moral panic and period of hardcore censorship would last in the public consciousness until the next moral panic took the world by storm, which was HIV and then the ozone layer. But the video nasty narrative didn't end in the 80s. It carried on right through to the 90s when the corporate media outdid the government by causing a panic that led to mild vigilantism. In 1993, a 2-year-old boy named James Bulger was murdered by 2 10-year-old boys in Merseyside. This was one of the highest profile crimes of the entire 90s in the UK, one that truly shook a whole nation, and one that had such an effect that it ripples through to this day. It wasn't just the fact that the killers were both children that caused so much pain, it was how they committed the crime. They lured James and kidnapped him, then tortured him before killing him. It was a horrendous crime, a crime so horrendous that the media were having the time of their life. They couldn't get enough of it. People couldn't get enough of the coverage. And when it was suggested that the 2 young killers had imitated a scene from the movie Child's Play 3, the corporate media went absolutely mental. The video nasty narrative had made a most welcome return. In Child's Play 3, there is a scene in which Chucky splashes one of his victims with blue paint, and James Bulger, without going into too much detail, had also been splashed with paint. It didn't take long for the media to go into hyperdrive and call for the banning of this cinematic filth. The Sun, another bastion of public morality, would go on to run a headline, "Burn your video nasty," which, if you hadn't have guessed, was a call out to the people to burn copies of Child's Play 3. And we all know that the public burnings of published materials is a great way forward for any society. During the trial of Bulger's killers, the judge, Mr. Justice Morland, claimed that exposure to violent movies may have influenced the behavior of the boys, as it had been revealed that one of them may have watched Child's Play 3 when it had been rented by his family a month before the murder. However, the boy's father and his solicitor refuted these claims and said that his son had never watched it, as his son didn't live with them full time and he'd rented the film when his son was actually staying with his mother. Also, during psychiatric analysis of the boy, it was determined that he hadn't seen it, and in fact, he didn't really like watching horror movies. But none of that matters, because until this day the corporate press still believes they did a good thing, and that good thing was getting Child's Play 3 banned through their relentless campaigning. However, it wasn't actually banned. A more accurate 2020s interpretation would be cancelled. The BBFC and the government didn't revoke its classification and ban it from distribution. It was, and always has been, still available for purchase and rental, but due to the frenzy stirred up by rags like The Sun, The Mirror and the Daily Mail, it caused the public to take action. Video rental services, from Blockbuster to the local corner shop, all removed the video from their shelves. Most outlets for selling videos also removed it, and not one UK TV network would dare broadcast it, even to this day. Even if you didn't believe in the fallacy that Child's Play 3 was responsible for the 2 boys' actions, such a film wasn't worth the hassle. You were saving yourself a lot of unnecessary grief just by throwing it in the bin. Following this moral public decision, the Mirror declared a victory on its front page. But this was no victory. It was hollow. The horrific murder of a small child will always trigger the public hard, and the sense of helplessness is so strong that any kind of victory puts a kind of balance back in the universe for a lot of people. But it doesn't solve any problem, especially a problem that isn't actually real. A couple of other film releases will fall victim to the Child's Play 3 banning hysteria. The Good Son, a psychological thriller starring everyone's favourite cheeky chappie, Macaulay Culkin, who played a murderous 12-year-old, was refused certification by the BBFC and therefore banned from release at the end of 1993. It did manage to get a release in 1995, going straight to video, after a long battle involving countless re-edits and resubmissions. Another film wasn't so lucky. Mikey, released the same year. Mikey wasn't as highbrow as The Good Son. It was a straightforward child slasher movie about an adopted young boy who turns out to be a murderous psychopath. The BBFC refused to give Mikey a certification, and the distributors didn't have the same resources as those who put out The Good Son, meaning they never got to submit an edit that appeased the censors, and has remained banned in this country ever since. The legacy of video nasties and moral panic remains to this day, and moral panic over art never stops. You sometimes forget that when you hear about a film, a TV show, comedy special, or a piece of music or art that's being cancelled and pulled. This isn't anything new. Moral panic stirred up by corporate media just shapeshifts to fit the culture and the trends of the time. Activists getting outraged and kicking up a stink is nothing new either. The moralizing hardline Christians who despised Elvis, straight-to-video horror movies, and Jerry Springer the Opera have all been updated. In this era, there are supposed liberal and socialist groups, and the kaleidoscope of subgroups with different agendas and ideologies. But don't get it twisted. These are hardline, moralizing, culturally conservative killjoys. They just don't have Mary Whitehouse's hairstyle sensibilities. Our modern era has been full of activists on social media screaming about something that's apparently dangerous, and in turn the corporate media pick up these stories and run with the juiciest ones. Stories like James Bulger's murder don't run for as long as they used to, and because news moves so fast in the digital age, it feels like everything is being cancelled, which is kind of true. But it just shows that the corporate media haven't changed their ways. They've just had to adapt to the technology and culture. Their crazy narratives constructed out of thin air will always be there for as long as they exist, because that's their cultural tradition. That's why an internationally recognized harmless hand gesture becomes a symbol that proves the so-called threat of white supremacist terrorism is true. That's why The Joker was suddenly the most dangerous film on earth, inspiring incels to commit mass murder. That's why a cartoon frog is considered a dangerous image of Nazi propaganda. That's why bored middle-aged housewives who watched an obscure video about child trafficking are apparent terrorists. That's why there's rampant concerns about children dressing up as characters on a popular Korean TV show for Halloween. That's why cuties... Oh, let's just leave out cuties.
Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiners war ein Befehl!
The point is, the more things change, the more they stay the same. People do understand the concept. It's only a movie, but only when it suits them. That is the truest thing about humans and our culture. If you're watching this video the day it came out, or a week later, or even 10 or 20 years in the future, there will undoubtedly be some piece of art, whether fine art or exploitation or just pure trash, that will be upsetting someone somewhere. And the media will be dancing around the fire, adding fuel they magicked out of thin air. The only way this stops is if they just go away. And if this is in the future, and victory is ours, and the corporate media have been crushed into obscurity, then please let this be a reminder that they should never be allowed to come back and do this all again. One man's filth is another man's treasure, and that treasure is sometimes power.